This is what I've learned over the last 10 years since losing a loved one. Ten years ago this month, I lost Sunshine, my girlfriend and the love of my life, and this is what I've learned about the grieving process over that period. There's been a ton of research on this topic, a lot of big words for the different phenomenons or stages. I'm going to try to use as simple and practical of terms as I can for this, just because it's how I think, and hopefully that makes it easier to convey what I'm trying to get across to you as well. There are many challenges that have knocked me down in life over the years, from divorce and poverty to issues with financial, legal, health, you name it. And they're all awful. They all feel like you've reached low in life, but tragedy is very relative. And the worst thing you've ever experienced is 100, and everything else is some portion of that. So it's like grading on a curve. Divorce felt like 100 when it happened. The heart surgery felt like 100 when that happened, my new low. But 10 years ago, all of those previous events felt like maybe a 5 out of 100 when I watched Sunshine take her last breath. Death is part of life. We all do it. And at some point, most of us will lose somebody very close to us. Now, over the years, I've lost all 4 grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, a classmate in a car wreck. They all hurt, they all suck, but at different levels. And one thing I kind of noticed over the years is it seemed like it hurt worse proportionally with the amount of time I'd spent with a person, or the impact it had on my life with them no longer being there. I had one cousin that I don't believe I'd ever met, that when he passed away, it made me sad to think that I had a cousin that passed away, as the idea of it, but it didn't really impact my life because I didn't spend time with him. I hadn't really got to know him. Conversely, I had another cousin die who I'd grown up around and spent a lot of time with, and that made it a whole lot harder to accept, harder to heal. It just hits you differently. In July of 2014, my girlfriend Sunshine, who I'd been with for 6 years, was diagnosed with cancer. And on All Souls Day, November 2nd of that same year, I kissed her cold, lifeless lips goodbye for the last time. There are many variables in loss. For me, I lost a girlfriend. For her parents, they lost a daughter. For the sister, they lost a sibling, friends, etc. Most would agree that losing someone down the ladder in a generation should never happen. We all kind of expect that we're going to lose our grandparents and our parents because they're older than us. But it does often feel like it violates the chain of nature when a generation above loses somebody below them, like a child, a niece or nephew. Her father made a comment that it would be easier to lose a significant other because you can replace that person. However, you may look at it a different way and say it's harder in that case because a parent or sibling will never have that potential guilt of looking for a replacement or thinking about the replacement. So death is just a very individual experience, and it can be so painfully blinding that we don't always realize what it's like for somebody else to have lost that person. We can only think of our sorrow at that time. One of the first things that we often feel is shock or disbelief, and I've watched parents that sort of stick in denial of the cop or the doctor must have made a mistake. It can't be my child that just died. For me, I felt the last pulse in her wrist. I watched her take her last breath and felt her body grow cold over the next couple hours. So there was no denying it. It was painfully clear what had happened for me. And maybe that makes it easier. This is where sometimes people wait for, say, the funeral to see the body in the casket before they will really accept that this person is really no longer here with us. And just because I didn't have the disbelief doesn't mean I didn't still have the shock, because it's very hard to get over that or avoid it, even with the advance notice of knowing that was coming in our case. One of the first lessons I had to learn is that there were often no right answers. I was faced with different decisions, and it wasn't as simple always as that pan is hot on the stove, it'll hurt if you touch it, don't touch it. There were a lot of choices where no matter what I chose, it was going to be bad in some way. And I had to get comfortable with making decisions that was the best of the options I had, but still knowingly choosing to do something that was going to be hurtful for me or others. At some point in loss, we go from feeling sorrow to often adding guilt to it. And there are a lot of different types of guilt. Sometimes, let's say somebody is driving the car and there's a fatal wreck and they lose the person next to them. That would be a huge amount of guilt to have to deal with, whether it's justified or not. Accidents do happen. There's also a case where, let's say, the person is driving a car that we knew was unsafe, or we shouldn't let them drive because they've been drinking, or whatever it is. But there's a lot of different kind of guilt that can happen. Now, for my case, I had nothing to do with the cancer that she had. Nobody could even explain how she got the cancer that she had. There was no scientific reason for it. So there was no direct guilt. What I had was good old-fashioned survivor's guilt. And even this can take multiple forms. Either I would lay in bed just feeling gutted, wailing in agony, and then on top of that hurt, feeling guilty because I knew it would hurt her to see me so miserable, knowing that she's the reason I feel that bad. On the other hand, if I eventually laughed at something Barron did or a movie, those milliseconds of happiness caused me to feel guilty because who was I to feel joy instead of mourning her? It was definitely a case of no right answers. But every day became an experiment, and in these times we often feel like we have no control over anything. But the reality is we do have control over our environment to some extent. So we have to use the tools at our disposal to try to better our situation. I did just every variable I could. If I found that listening to some of the highway country, as I went for drives through the hill country with Barron that we used to listen to with her, if I found that that was upsetting, then I wouldn't do it. But if I found that listening to heavy metal made me kind of angry, but at least I didn't hurt so bad, then I don't know that it was necessarily healthy, but it made me feel better. I looked at certain foods, like all we could get her to eat towards the end were root beer floats and Oreo shakes. So I'd find myself having those as sort of a way to remember her. But at some point, I started feeling guilty because I wasn't taking care of myself and I knew I should be eating better. So the way you feel changes over time. Are you doing more things that you used to share with that person, or are you better to go find new things to do instead? You just have to try new things every day and figure out what works for you. When you lose someone that's a big part of your life, you find yourself with ample time all of a sudden, and it's very important to be smart about how you spend that time. Again, remember, there may be no right answers, but there could be better answers. This is very dependent on the individual, but each of us has to find what works best for us. There are some people that may have lost a significant other but still have kids and they have to be strong for their kids. Or there may be people that are just on their own, like me with a dog, that I can be more selfish. But however you find your situation, most would agree that it's important to deal with the feelings you're having somehow or another and not just ignore them, because while you're ignoring it, that grief is over in the corner doing push-ups, getting stronger, and when you come back, it's going to hurt that much worse. A lot of people need loved ones to help them through that. They rely on friends and family for support. sounding boards to just listen sometimes. For me personally, everything rough I've gone through in life, I've pretty much done on my own. So there was no point trying to start something new at this point for me. I was going to do what had worked before. Some people may go to a therapist to talk to them. For me personally, I know that if I were to have gone to a therapist to talk about the grief, I would have felt weaker. I would have felt like I'd fallen so far that I couldn't even independently help myself anymore. And you can think what you want about that logic. It's just, I know that about myself. And so for me, in order to deal with it in a way that I could still feel better about myself, I wrote it down and ended up making a book out of it. The point is, there's no right or wrong way to deal with it, as long as you're processing it and not just ignoring it and bottling it up for later. We also have to be careful because loss can be a nasty inflection point for bad habits. These are the times when addictions can start, resurface if they've been dormant for a while, or amp up. I'd finally learned to moderate my drinking, but that demon is always waiting there to whip its pointed tail at me again. Now, there's nothing wrong from distracting yourself so you're not all consumed with the grief, but it's a whole lot different to go out with a friend and have a drink or two versus polishing off a fifth of whiskey because you're miserable. I am well aware of my self-destructive habits, and I knew that was absolutely the wrong time to be indulging in them. So for at least 6 or more months after the fact, I didn't go near anything that would be like that. I didn't touch one of the fast vehicles, a drop, a booze, anything. When I did finally start at a moderate level, I found myself running up against the guardrails again and decided I needed to pull back for a few months and try to get smarter about it before I tried again. Everything we've talked about so far is about how we manage ourselves through grief. But one topic that's really not discussed that much is managing the people around us as we're going through that grief. And much like the grief itself, it's a very individual thing. It takes an experiment every day, and there are sometimes no right answers. Some people need support from others. They need people to ask them how they're doing. They need to be able to offload to them, to talk about how they're feeling, whatever it may be, to know that there are other people that care effectively. The problem with that is if that's all you do, you can get so consumed by the grief that basically you end up defined by the loss. Grief can eat you alive, and if you're even spending your time out of your head talking to others close to you and you're still talking about it, your brain never gets a break from it. It's completely understandable that friends and family are going to ask how you're doing at the beginning, but when the timing's right, it's a good idea to start shifting those conversations back to other topics, make it a more positive interaction and maybe a little bit more of a distraction for yourself. For me, I got to the point where I got so sick of coworkers giving me pitiful looks, asking how I was doing, that I had a strong desire to just punch them in the throat. It was well intended, sure, but did it help? Not a bit. So what I started doing was just deflecting. If they asked how I was doing, I would try to be upbeat and say, "Great, how are you doing?" And just flip it around and try to move on from it to try to control the conversation. I joined a new gym about that time, and now I had a whole building of people that had no idea that I just lost my girlfriend. So I went in there and I just tried to be, I always want to be as genuine and sincere as I can, but in that case I found myself being so friendly it about made me gag, just whether it was saying hi to everybody that worked at the front desk or to the trainers or to the people in the gym, just trying to be the friendliest version of myself I could. And I thought, hopefully my inside eventually catches up with my outside. I got a lot of well-intended, unsolicited advice during this period, and I get it. People don't know what to say. We all know there's nothing they really can say to make anything better, but they feel they have to say something. They feel they have to try, and when they do that, all they're really doing is making you know that they care. Amidst all the Hallmark level depth of wording that I got, there were actually some things that people said that did help me. And coincidentally, I'm sure, 2 of the items that were helpful came from 2 people who had also lost somebody very close to them. The first one was, it doesn't get better, it gets different. And I think this was important for me because it set expectations. I wasn't feeling better day to day. I was just miserable every day. But what I started noticing is differences in my behavior a little bit. So even though I didn't feel any better, by seeing my behavior change, it gave me this shred of hope that I wouldn't have to feel this way for the rest of my life. The other thing that was told to me was, it's up to us to honor their memory. Those words drove me to be the best person that I could, to brighten people's day, to be a good person, to not take my health and my life for granted, but to work hard to exercise and eat right and just be as good a person I can. And the other thing that was said was, Sunshine's final words to her sister when we were both sitting there was, be happy. So that became the other focus, not just taking care of myself and being a good person, but trying to really be happy in life, being someone that she would be proud of. And that meant taking time and enjoying whatever activities with Bear and our dog that we'd gotten together, because it was just him and me at that point. And I cannot imagine how much worse the whole experience would have been without him. It was already like a tomb in here, but had it not been for his little claws tapping across the wood floor, I don't even know how I would have survived it. We create our own narratives to make ourselves feel better as well, especially when you start dealing with something like death or grief. Everybody has their own beliefs and what they think of an afterlife, etc. And it doesn't always make sense when we're doing it, but we tell ourselves these things just to ease the pain sometimes. For example, in our front yard, the spring after she passed away, we had lilies spring up from the ground, and we'd never had them there before. Now, I could look at that and say, oh, it's got to be a miracle that these flowers grew that she loved after she passed away. I know as an engineer, there's a logical reason. We probably had lilies in the house because everybody was sending her flowers, and it looked like a funeral home in here before she even passed. Someone probably dumped the water out with the seeds in the front yard, and that's where the lilies came from. Even though I know those logical reasons for it, it doesn't mean that I can't look at them in the spring when they blossom and smile and think of her and remember her fondly. And that's really the goal through grief, is to get to that point. When I first lost Sunshine, everything I did hurt. Either it was something that I remember doing with her and that made me miss her and hurt, or it was something new that I tried and it hurt because she wasn't there to enjoy it. So every time I thought of her, it was 100% misery and 0% happiness. Over the 10 years, of course, that ratio has shifted, and every time now that I think of her, there's still hurt, but there is some happiness, and the ratio is getting better, and it's never gonna be no pain. It's always gonna have a sting, but the more you can get to where it's thinking of her brings fond memories, happiness, and really what matters the most is to feel lucky for the 6.5 years I had with her. And that is really where you want to end up with in your grief process. If you haven't done so, please subscribe to the channel below, click the bell for notifications, and live for today.